fire in the great hall roared high, throwing orange light across hundreds of watching faces, but Elena felt cold to her bones. She stood at the center of the ceremony platform in a gown stitched with silver thread, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the room could hear it. Tonight was supposed to be the night she became Damon's wife. Tonight was supposed to be the beginning of everything she had waited for since she was a girl of 12, watching him train in the courtyard and telling herself that one day he would see her the way she saw him. Instead, Damon stood 3 steps away, his jaw tight, refusing to meet her eyes. The elder conducting the ceremony, a stooped man named Corwin, glanced between them with growing unease. He cleared his throat and repeated the binding words, waiting for Damon to speak his vow. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the crowd, a child coughed. Somewhere else, a log popped in the fire. "Damon," Elena whispered, so quiet only he could hear it. "Say the words." He finally looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes was not love. It was pity, and beneath the pity, something colder. Guilt, perhaps, dressed up as duty. "I can't," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried through the hall as if he had shouted it. "I can't marry you, Elena." Gasps rippled through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. Elena felt her knees threaten to buckle, but she forced herself to stand straight, the way her mother had taught her. "Never let them see you break," her mother used to say. "Whatever they take from you, keep your spine." "What are you saying?" Elena asked, though some small, terrible part of her already understood. Damon turned toward the crowd, and from the side entrance of the hall, a woman stepped forward. She wore deep violet silk, and her dark hair was braided with strands of gold thread that caught the firelight like tiny flames. Elena recognized her instantly. Serafina, daughter of the Ashcombe pack, one of the last full-blooded lines left in the region. Elena had seen her only once before, at a gathering of allied packs 2 winters ago, and even then she had noticed the way Serafina moved, like someone who had never once doubted her place in the world. "The alliance with the Ashcombe pack," Damon said, forcing the words out as though they tasted bitter, "is not something I can turn away from. Our territory is shrinking. Our numbers are weak. My father has made it clear that our future depends on strengthening our bloodline, not diluting it further." Diluting it further. Elena felt the words land like a blow to the chest. She was a half-blood, born to a shifter father and a human mother, and though she had spent her whole life proving her strength in the training grounds, proving her loyalty in every task given to her, in this moment, none of that mattered. Blood was blood, and hers was not pure enough. "So this was never about love," Elena said quietly. "It was never about the years we spent together, the promises." "It was," Damon said, and for one flickering moment his composure cracked. "It was real to me. But I have responsibilities you don't understand. I have to think about the pack, about what comes after me." "And Serafina understands that better than I do?" Elena's voice rose despite herself. "Because her blood is cleaner than mine?" Serafina's chin lifted, but she said nothing. She did not need to. Her silence was its own kind of cruelty, the confidence of someone who had already won. Elena looked around the hall, at the faces she had grown up among, the pack she had trained with, fought beside, bled for. Some looked away in shame. Others watched with open curiosity, the kind reserved for a spectacle rather than a person. She realized, with a clarity that hurt worse than the rejection itself, that she was alone in this room. Utterly, completely alone. She did not cry. She refused to give them that. Instead, she reached up with steady hands and unpinned the silver circlet from her hair, the one that marked her as a bride, and let it fall to the stone floor with a small, sharp clatter. The sound echoed louder than it should have in the sudden silence. "Then I release you from whatever you imagine you owe me," Elena said, looking directly at Damon. "Enjoy your pure blood, Damon. I hope her lineage keeps you warm at night, because it seems to be all you ever truly wanted." She turned before he could answer, gathering the heavy fabric of her gown, and walked out of the hall with her head high, though every step felt like walking across broken glass. Behind her, she heard murmurs rising like a swarm of insects, but she did not look back. She would not give any of them the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. The moment she passed through the great doors and into the cool night air, her composure shattered. She ran. She did not know where she was going, only that she needed to be far from the hall, far from the fire, and the silver circlet lying abandoned on the floor, far from the eyes that had watched her be discarded. like something used and unwanted. Her thin slippers were useless against the rocky ground, but she barely noticed the sting of stones beneath her feet. The forest at the edge of the territory rose ahead of her, dark and endless, and she plunged into it without hesitation. Branches caught at her gown, tearing the careful stitching, but she welcomed the destruction of it. She did not want to wear a wedding dress that had witnessed her humiliation for one more moment than necessary. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs shook, until the sounds of the hall were long behind her, swallowed by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of night birds. Finally, she could run no further. Her body gave out beneath her, and she collapsed at the base of an ancient oak tree, its roots gnarled and thick, rising from the earth like the knuckles of some sleeping giant. She pressed her back against the rough bark and pulled her knees to her chest. And there, finally, alone in the dark, she let herself weep. She cried for the years she had wasted loving someone who saw her as a compromise rather than a choice. She cried for the humiliation of standing before her entire pack and being told she was not enough. She cried because some small, foolish part of her heart had believed, right up until the very last second, that Damon would say the words, that he would choose her. The forest around her seemed to hold its breath, the wind still, the night birds quiet, as though even nature understood she needed this moment of grief before she could face what came next. She did not know how long she sat there, wrapped in the wreckage of her torn gown and her broken pride, before she noticed the air had changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in temperature, a heaviness that settled over the clearing like a held breath. Elena lifted her head, her senses sharpening instinctively, years of training rising up beneath the grief. She was not alone. She scanned the darkness between the trees, her pulse quickening, and then she saw him. He stood perhaps 20 paces away, half hidden in shadow, and yet somehow the shadow seemed to bend around him rather than conceal him. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than any man she had ever seen, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb what little moonlight filtered through the canopy above. His eyes, when they met hers, glowed faintly amber, the mark of a shifter in a state between forms, though something about the intensity of that glow told her this was no ordinary shifter. Every pack story she had ever heard as a child suddenly rose in her memory, tales told in hushed voices around fires late at night. Stories of the Lycan bloodlines, older and more powerful than any shifter clan, beings who ruled not through alliance and diplomacy but through sheer, undeniable strength. Stories of a Lycan lord who claimed the deep forest as his territory, who was said to move through packs and politics like smoke through fingers, untouchable, unclaimed by any treaty or tradition. She had always thought those stories were exaggerated. Standing in this clearing, staring at the being before her, she was no longer certain. "You are trespassing," he said. His voice was low and even, carrying easily across the distance between them despite its quietness, as though the forest itself made room for his words. There was no anger in his tone, only a flat statement of fact. Elena scrambled to her feet, ignoring the way her legs trembled, and forced herself to stand tall despite her torn gown and tear-streaked face. Whatever pride she had left, she was not going to lose it in front of a stranger, even one who looked like he could tear her apart without effort. "I didn't know these woods belonged to anyone," she said, proud of how steady her voice came out. "I'll leave." "You're bleeding," he said, instead of responding to her offer. She glanced down and realized he was right. Her feet, torn by stones during her frantic run, had left small dark marks in the soil beneath her. She had been too consumed by grief and adrenaline to notice the pain until now, and once she noticed it, it bloomed sharp and insistent.
"It's nothing,"
she said. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving from her bare, bleeding feet to the torn, silver-threaded gown, to the tear tracks drying on her cheeks, to the fury and grief still burning in her eyes. Whatever he was searching for, he seemed to find it, because something in his expression shifted, though she could not name what it became. "A wedding gown," he observed, "yet no groom accompanies you into the forest at night." Elena's throat tightened. She did not owe this stranger, however powerful he might be, any explanation of what had happened in that hall. And yet something about the directness of his question, the absence of pity in it, made her want to answer. "There was no wedding," she said finally. "Not for me, anyway." "He rejected you," the man said. It was not a question. "How would you know that?" "Because a woman does not run barefoot through a forbidden forest at night, weeping until her voice is raw, over a wedding that went as planned. His tone remained even, almost clinical, and yet she did not feel mocked by it. If anything, she felt seen in a way she had not been seen in that entire hall full of familiar faces. "What is your name?" "Elena," she said, before she could decide whether she should share it. "Elena Voss." "Cade," he said simply, offering nothing further. No family name, no title, though she suspected he did not need one. Even without knowing exactly who he was, something in the way he carried himself, the absolute stillness of his presence, told her that this was someone whose name alone likely commanded fear and respect across territories she had never even heard of. "You should return to your pack before they send trackers into these woods looking for you," Cade said. "It would be unfortunate for them to find you here." "I'm not going back," Elena said, and even as the words left her mouth, she felt the truth of them settle into her chest. She could not walk back into that hall, could not face the pitying glances and the whispered gossip that would follow her for months, maybe years. She could not watch Damon build a life with Serafina, while pretending she was fine with the scraps of dignity left to her. Not tonight. Not ever. If I can help it. Cade tilted his head slightly, studying her with those amber eyes, as though reconsidering something. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft rustle of leaves overhead and the distant sound of a stream somewhere beyond the trees. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "we should discuss what happens next." Elena's heart, already battered and raw from the events of the evening, gave an unexpected lurch at those words. She did not know what he meant, could not begin to guess what a being like him could possibly want, with a heartbroken half-blood woman standing in his forest with bleeding feet and a torn wedding gown. But something in his tone, quiet and deliberate, told her that this chance encounter in the dark was not going to be the end of her story. It was, perhaps, only the beginning. Elena stood frozen in the clearing, staring at the man who called himself Cade, uncertain whether she should feel afraid or curious. Every instinct she had honed over years of training told her that this being was dangerous, that the amber glow in his eyes and the unnatural stillness of his presence marked him as something far beyond an ordinary shifter. And yet, standing there in her torn gown with her feet bleeding into the soil, she found she was too exhausted, too hollowed out by grief, to summon the fear she probably should have felt. "What do you mean, discuss what happens next?" she asked, wrapping her arms around herself against the night chill that seemed to seep more deeply into her skin the longer she stood still. Cade moved closer, and though his steps were unhurried, she felt the weight of his approach as though the very air thickened around him. He stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough that she did not feel cornered. "I have spent the past several months observing the tension between your pack and the Ashcombe line," he said. "Alliances built on blood purity rarely hold as firmly as the packs forming them believe. There are cracks already forming beneath the surface of this arrangement, cracks that will widen with time." "I don't see what that has to do with me," Elena said, though a small, wary part of her was listening closely. "It has everything to do with you," Cade said. "Because tonight, without meaning to, you became a symbol. The pack that discarded a loyal daughter in favor of a stronger bloodline. Word of what happened in that hall will spread faster than you can imagine, and it will not paint your former pack in a flattering light, no matter how they try to frame it." Elena let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Forgive me, if that brings me little comfort right now." "It should bring you more than comfort," Cade said. "It should bring you opportunity." She studied him more closely then, trying to read the intentions behind his calm, measured words. "What opportunity could possibly come from being humiliated in front of everyone I have ever known?" Cade was quiet for a moment, as though weighing how much to reveal. When he spoke again, his voice had lost none of its steadiness, but something in it had shifted, become more deliberate. "I hold territory that borders 3 separate shifter domains, including the lands claimed by the pack you just left. My position has been contested in recent seasons by rivals who believe a Lycan lord without a bonded mate is a Lycan lord vulnerable to challenge. Ancient law recognizes a mate bond as proof of stability, of a leader secure enough in his position to share it." Elena's breath caught as understanding began to dawn, though she almost could not believe where his words seemed to be leading. "You're saying you need a mate." "I am saying, I need a bonded partner whose claim cannot be easily disputed," Cade corrected. "And you, Elena Voss, arrived in my forest tonight, already carrying a story that would make our union impossible for anyone to frame as weakness. A woman wronged by a lesser leader, who chooses instead to bind herself to power that does not require her blood to be anything other than what it is. You want to marry a stranger you met an hour ago in the woods, Elena said flatly, because it would be politically convenient. I want to propose an arrangement that benefits us both, Cade said. You would never again be forced to explain yourself to a pack that valued bloodline over loyalty, and I would secure my position against those who would challenge it. Elena wrapped her arms tighter around herself, torn between the absurdity of the proposal and the strange, undeniable pull she felt to at least hear him out further. And if I refuse? Then I will see that your wounds are tended, and you will be free to go wherever you choose, Cade said simply. I am not in the business of forcing bonds on anyone. It would defeat the entire purpose of what I am offering. His honesty, blunt as it was, settled something in her chest. She had spent years being managed, being handled with careful words, designed to keep her compliant and hopeful within a pack that never truly valued her. Cade's directness, cold as it seemed, felt almost like relief in comparison. Why me? She asked quietly. You could have chosen someone from a powerful lineage, someone who would bring alliances of her own. Because power built on inherited blood is fragile, Cade said. It depends entirely on others, recognizing that blood is valuable. Power built on choice, on a bond formed freely between two people who owe nothing to bloodlines or old debts, is far harder to dismantle. You are not a political marriage, Elena. You would be proof that I do not need one. Elena considered his words in the quiet of the clearing, the events of the night pressing against her like a physical weight. She thought of the hall she had fled, of Damon's guilty eyes and Seraphina's silent confidence, of the whispers that would follow her name through the territory for seasons to come. She thought of returning to a life where she would forever be known as the woman who was not enough. And then she thought of walking away from all of it in one decisive act, transforming her humiliation into something no one in that hall could have anticipated. If I agree, she said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them, what would this bond require of me? Loyalty, Cade said. Honesty. A willingness to stand beside me as my equal, not my subordinate. The bond itself, once formed, cannot be easily undone. It is deeper than the bonds your kind forms. It ties not only intention, but instinct, drawing two people together in ways that go beyond simple agreement. That sounds less like a business arrangement and more like a permanent commitment, Elena said. It is both, Cade admitted. I will not pretend otherwise. But I do not ask for false affection, Elena. I ask only for partnership, and whatever grows between us beyond that will grow honestly, or it will not grow at all. Something about his willingness to be so plainly truthful, when Damon had spent years dressing his hesitations in soft words and empty promises, struck Elena harder than she expected. She realized, standing there in the cold clearing with blood drying on her feet, that she believed him. Whatever else Cade was, whatever danger he might represent to lesser beings who crossed him, he was not lying to her. The ceremony, she said. How is it performed? Beneath the moon, with blood and voice, Cade said. It requires no elder, no witnesses beyond the forest itself, only the willing consent of both parties, spoken aloud beneath open sky. Elena looked up through the canopy above them, where the moon hung heavy and pale, its light filtering down in broken patches across the clearing floor. She thought of the silver circlet she had left lying on the stone floor of the great hall, of the vows Damon had refused to speak, of the future she had imagined for herself that had been stripped away in a matter of moments, before an audience of people she had once called family. She thought, too, of the strange, fierce clarity she felt now, standing in this dark forest with a being of legend, offering her a path forward that had nothing to do with proving her worth to anyone who had already decided she lacked it. Do it, she said, before she could talk herself out of the decision. Tonight, before I change my mind, or before word spreads and someone comes looking for me. Cade studied her for a long moment, as though giving her one final chance to reconsider. When she did not waver, he nodded once, and something in his posture shifted, a subtle acknowledgement that the decision had been made and there would be no undoing it. Then we begin, he said. He moved closer, until only a few feet separated them, and Elena felt the strange charge in the air intensify, a pressure against her skin that had nothing to do with temperature. Cade reached into the folds of his dark clothing and produced a small blade, its edge catching what little moonlight reached them. "The bond requires blood from us both," he explained, his voice steady, despite the gravity of what they were about to do. "A small offering, nothing more. It marks the beginning, a signal to whatever old magic still lingers in these woods, that a new bond has been chosen freely." Elena extended her hand without hesitation, though her pulse hammered against her ribs. Cade took her palm gently, his grip firm but careful, and drew the blade across her skin in a shallow line. She hissed softly at the sting, but did not pull away. He repeated the motion across his own palm, and then pressed his palm to hers, blood mingling between them in the dim light. "Speak your intention," Cade instructed. "Simply and honestly. The words matter less than the truth behind them." Elena drew a steadying breath, looking into those amber eyes that had watched her with such unnerving stillness since the moment she first noticed him in the clearing. "I choose this bond freely," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I choose to stand beside you as an equal, and I ask nothing of you that I am not also willing to give in return." Cade's expression, usually so composed, flickered with something she could not quite name, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I choose this bond freely," he echoed. "I choose to stand beside you as an equal, and I offer you protection, honesty, and partnership for as long as this bond endures." The moment the final words left his mouth, Elena felt something shift deep within her chest, a warmth spreading outward from where their palms pressed together, unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was not painful, but it was undeniable, a sensation like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed inside her. She gasped softly, and across from her, Cade's jaw tightened, his own reaction to whatever had just passed between them, clearly not what he had expected either. "It is done," he said quietly, releasing her hand at last. "The bond has taken hold." Elena looked down at her palm, where the small cut had already begun to close, leaving only a faint pink line behind. She flexed her fingers, testing the strange new awareness humming beneath her skin, a sense of connection to the man standing before her that she could not fully explain. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Cade said, "you come with me. There is much you do not yet understand about the bond we have formed, and much I did not anticipate about how strongly it would settle between us. But whatever comes next, we will face it as partners, exactly as we promised." He extended his hand toward her, an invitation rather than a command, and after only a moment's hesitation, Elena took it. Behind her, the forest stretched dark and quiet, holding the memory of everything she had left behind. Ahead of her, an unknown path stretched into deeper shadow, toward whatever life awaited her, beside a being whose power and mystery she was only beginning to understand. She did not look back as they walked together deeper into the trees. For the first time since she had run from that hall, she felt something other than grief settling into her chest. It was not quite happiness, not yet, but it was, unmistakably, the feeling of a new beginning. Elena woke to unfamiliar light filtering through tall windows, and for a disoriented moment she could not remember where she was. The bed beneath her was soft, layered with dark furs and heavy blankets, and the room around her was built of stone, high-ceilinged and imposing, unlike anything in the modest quarters she had grown up in. Then the memory of the previous night crashed back into her all at once. The rejection, the flight through the forest, the blade, the blood, the bond. She sat up quickly, her heart racing, and glanced down at her palm. The faint pink line remained, proof that the events of last night had not been some grief-fueled dream. A soft knock sounded at the door before it opened, and a young woman entered carrying a folded set of clothing. She had warm brown eyes and dark hair pulled back neatly, and she offered Elena a small, careful smile. "Lord Cade said you would need something to wear," the woman said. "My name is Marissa. I attend to matters within the manor." Elena accepted the clothing with a murmured thanks, still trying to orient herself in this strange new world she had stepped into. "Where exactly am I?" "This is Lord Cade's manor, deep within the territory he holds," Marissa said. "Most call it Ravenswood, though few outside these walls have ever set foot inside." She hesitated, studying Elena with poorly concealed curiosity. "Forgive me for asking, but is it true that you and Lord Cade are bonded?" Elena's fingers tightened briefly around the fabric in her hands. "It's true. Marissa's eyes widened slightly, though she quickly composed herself. Then you should know the household will need time to adjust. Lord Cade has never taken a mate before. None of us expected this, especially not so suddenly. Neither did I, Elena admitted quietly. After Marissa left her to dress, Elena examined the clothing laid out for her. Simple, well-made garments in deep gray, practical rather than ornamental, nothing like the elaborate gowns she had worn the previous night. She dressed quickly, grateful to shed the last remnants of her ruined wedding attire, and made her way out into the corridor, uncertain where to go, but unwilling to remain confined to the room any longer. The manor was vast, its stone corridors lined with old tapestries and dim, flickering lanterns, giving the entire structure a hushed, watchful quality. Elena wandered until she found a wide staircase leading down to what appeared to be a great hall, smaller than the one she had fled the previous night, but no less imposing. Cade stood near a long table, speaking quietly with two men she did not recognize, both dressed in dark, practical clothing similar to his own. All three fell silent the moment she entered, and Elena felt the weight of their attention settle on her. "Elena," Cade said, and something in the way he spoke her name, calm and steady, eased some of the tension knotting her shoulders. "These are Garrick and Fenwick, two of my most trusted advisors." The taller of the two men, Garrick, inclined his head toward her, his expression unreadable. The shorter man, Fenwick, offered a more open smile, though his eyes carried a sharpness that suggested he missed very little. "So the rumors were true," Fenwick said, his tone carrying equal parts curiosity and disbelief. "You bonded with a half-blood shifter you found wandering the forest." "I did," Cade said simply, offering no further explanation, though his tone made clear the matter was not open for debate. Garrick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My lord, forgive my bluntness, but this is a significant departure from anything we discussed. The Southern faction already questions your leadership. A hastily formed bond with an unknown outsider could be seen as reckless rather than strategic." "The bond was not formed carelessly," Cade said, his voice remaining level despite the challenge in Garrick's words. "It was formed with full understanding of what it means, by two people who chose it freely." Elena felt the urge to defend herself rise sharply in her chest, unwilling to stand silently while these men discussed her as though she were not present. "I understand I am unexpected," she said, drawing both men's attention toward her. "But I am not a liability. Whatever concerns you have about this bond, I intend to prove them wrong." Garrick studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his guarded expression, though whether it was surprise or grudging respect, Elena could not tell. "We shall see," he said finally, before excusing himself from the hall, Fenwick following close behind. Once they had gone, Elena turned to Cade, crossing her arms. "Is that going to be a common reaction? Suspicion? Resentment?" "From some," Cade admitted. "The bond I formed with you challenges assumptions many have held about how power should be secured within Lycan territories. Not everyone will accept the change easily, but their acceptance is not required, only their obedience, and that I have already secured through years of proving my strength." "And what about my acceptance among them?" Elena asked. "I can't very well stand beside you as an equal partner if half your household views me as a mistake." Cade considered her question seriously, his amber eyes studying her with the same intense focus she remembered from the forest clearing. "Then we will need to ensure they understand quickly that you are not a mistake," he said. "There is much about our bond, and about Lycan customs, you do not yet know. It would serve us both if you began learning immediately." Over the following hours, Cade led her through the manor, explaining the history of his territory, the delicate balance of power between the various factions that answered to him, and the ancient customs that governed Lycan society, distinct in many ways from the shifter traditions she had grown up within. Elena listened carefully, absorbing every detail, aware that her survival within this new world depended on understanding its rules as quickly as possible. It was during this tour that Cade brought her to a small private study, lined with old books and maps, and there, for the first time since the bonding ceremony, he addressed something that had clearly been weighing on him. "There is something you should understand about our bond," he said, closing the heavy door behind them. "The connection between us is unlike typical shifter-mate bonds. Lycan bonds run deeper, drawing not only on emotional connection, but on instinct and biology both. What you felt last night, the warmth spreading through you when the bond took hold. That was only the beginning. What do you mean? Elena asked, a note of wariness creeping into her voice. The bond will grow stronger the more time we spend together, Kate explained. It will heighten certain instincts, certain reactions. You may find yourself more attuned to my presence, my moods, even at a distance. In time, you may develop abilities you did not previously possess, drawn from the strength of the bond itself. Elena absorbed this information slowly, trying to reconcile the pragmatic marriage of convenience she had agreed to with the far more intimate reality Cade was now describing. You didn't mention any of this last night. I did not fully anticipate how strongly the bond would settle, Cade admitted, and something in his tone suggested this admission cost him more than he wanted to reveal. Bonds of this nature are rare. Most Lycans go centuries without forming one at all, choosing instead to rule alone rather than risk the vulnerability such a connection creates. Vulnerability, Elena repeated. You make it sound like a weakness. To some, it would be, Cade said. A bonded mate can be used against a Lycan lord by anyone clever enough to threaten her safety. It is, in many ways, the greatest weakness I could expose myself to. Elena considered this, understanding for the first time the true weight of what Cade had risked in choosing her, a stranger, over the safety of remaining unbonded. Then why do it at all? Why not find another way to secure your position? Cade was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the forest stretched dark and endless beyond the manor walls. Because a position secured through fear alone eventually crumbles, he said finally. I would rather risk vulnerability for genuine strength than rule forever through intimidation that could shatter the moment someone challenges it convincingly enough. Elena studied him in the dim light of the study, seeing beyond the imposing figure who commanded fear and respect throughout his territory, glimpsing instead the calculated, careful mind beneath, a leader who had clearly thought through every consequence of his choices long before acting on them. Then we had better make certain this bond proves its strength, she said. Something in Cade's expression shifted, the faintest suggestion of approval crossing his otherwise composed features. Yes, he agreed, we had better. Outside the study window, the forest stirred with the sounds of late afternoon, birds calling to one another as the sun began its slow descent toward evening. Elena felt the weight of everything ahead of her, the challenges of proving herself within a household still uncertain of her place, the mysteries of a bond deeper and stranger than anything she had imagined, and the distant echo of a life she had left behind in ruins. And yet, standing there in that quiet study beside a man who had chosen honesty over comfortable lies, she felt something she had not expected to feel so soon after her humiliation. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she stood exactly where she was meant to be. 3 days after the bonding, Elena stood in the training yard behind Ravenswood Manor, watching a group of Cade's guards spar with wooden weapons under the pale morning sun. She had asked Marissa for practical clothing suited to movement, and now, dressed in fitted leather and cotton, she felt more like herself than she had since arriving at the manor. She had spent every spare moment since her arrival trying to understand the strange new awareness humming beneath her skin, the bond Cade had described growing steadily stronger with each passing hour. She could sense, faintly, the direction of his presence even when he was not in the room with her, a subtle pull like a compass needle finding north. It unsettled her, this new sense she had not asked for, and did not fully understand, but she was determined not to let it overwhelm her. You're staring rather intently at men who could probably use the practice, a voice said from behind her, and Elena turned to find Fenwick approaching, his expression carrying the same sharp curiosity she had noticed during their first meeting. I was a trained fighter within my former pack, Elena said. I'm trying to judge how different Lycan combat techniques are from what I already know. Fenwick's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not expecting this response. Most bonded mates content themselves with managing household affairs, he said. Lord Cade did not mention you had combat training. There's a great deal about me Lord Cade is still learning, Elena replied evenly, just as I am still learning about him, and about this place. Fenwick studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind his gaze, though not unkind. Garrick believes you are a liability, he said bluntly. A weakness Lord Cade has exposed himself to at the worst possible time. I confess I shared some of that concern initially. And now? Elena asked, refusing to look away from his scrutiny. "Now I am uncertain," Fenwick admitted. "You do not carry yourself like someone seeking protection or favor. You carry yourself like someone accustomed to earning her place through effort, rather than birthright." He paused, glancing toward the sparring guards. "Perhaps you should show them what a half-blood shifter is capable of. It might quiet certain doubts more effectively than words ever could." Elena considered his suggestion carefully, aware that this could easily be a trap designed to embarrass her further, but something in Fenwick's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than malice. She squared her shoulders and approached the sparring circle, where the guards paused their exercises, clearly surprised by her sudden interest. "Would one of you be willing to spar with me?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. The guards exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond to their lord's newly bonded mate requesting combat practice. Finally, a broad-shouldered guard named Halric stepped forward, offering her a wooden practice blade, with an expression that suggested he expected this exercise to end quickly and without incident. Elena accepted the blade, testing its weight, familiar despite the unfamiliar setting. She had trained for years within her former pack, honing her skills not because it was expected of her, but because it was one of the few areas where her effort had always been rewarded, regardless of her bloodline. The first exchange came quickly, Halric testing her defenses with a series of measured strikes that Elena deflected without difficulty, years of muscle memory guiding her movements. She saw the surprise flicker across his face and pressed her advantage, countering with a strike of her own that he barely managed to block. Word of the impromptu match seemed to spread quickly through the training yard, and soon a small crowd had gathered to watch, including Garrick, who observed from the shaded edge of the yard with his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral. Elena fought with focused determination, drawing on every lesson she had ever learned, every hour of practice that had once felt like the only place she truly belonged within her former pack. She matched Halric strike for strike, and though he was clearly stronger, his reliance on brute force left openings she was quick to exploit. When she finally disarmed him, sending his practice blade skittering across the packed dirt of the training yard, a stunned silence fell over the gathered crowd before scattered applause broke out among the watching guards. Halric, to his credit, offered her a genuine grin despite his defeat. Not bad, for someone raised outside Lycan territory. "I'll take that as a compliment," Elena said, breathing hard, but unable to suppress her own smile. She glanced toward the edge of the yard and found Cade standing there, having apparently arrived sometime during the match, watching her with an unreadable expression that nonetheless carried something warmer than his usual composed neutrality. Their eyes met, and Elena felt the bond between them pulse faintly, a strange, wordless acknowledgement passing between them. "Impressive," Cade said, once the crowd had dispersed, and only Elena and the closest guards remained. "You did not mention your training." "You never asked," Elena replied, handing her practice blade back to Halric with a nod of thanks. "I am asking now," Cade said, falling into step beside her as she walked toward the manor. "Tell me about your life before last night. I know almost nothing about the woman I bonded myself to." Elena considered how much to share, aware that trust between them was still fragile and new, built more on necessity than genuine familiarity. But something about his direct request, free of judgment, encouraged her honesty. "My mother was human," she said. "My father was a shifter within the pack, though not a particularly prominent one. I grew up constantly aware that half my blood was considered lesser by those around me, no matter how hard I worked to prove otherwise." "And Damon?" Cade asked, his tone carefully neutral, though Elena sensed a deeper curiosity behind the question. "We grew up together," Elena said. "I loved him for most of my life, or at least I loved the idea of him, the promise that if I proved myself enough, my bloodline would stop mattering to the people around me. I understand now how foolish that hope was." Cade was quiet for a moment as they walked, the manor's stone walls rising ahead of them in the afternoon light. "It was not foolish to hope for acceptance," he said finally. "It was only misplaced, given to someone unworthy of the effort you invested in him." Elena glanced at him, surprised by the directness of his assessment. "You barely know him." "I know enough," Cade said. "A leader who values bloodline purity over loyalty and genuine strength is not a leader I would trust with difficult decisions. Your former pack's future under his guidance concerns me far more than any concerns Garrick holds about our bond." Why would his leadership concern you? Elena asked. Because packs led by fear of insufficient bloodline, rather than genuine strength, eventually fracture from within, Cade said, and fractured packs create instability along my borders. It is not merely a personal observation, Elena. It is a strategic one. Elena considered this, recognizing the careful, calculating mind behind Cade's every observation, a leader who saw every situation through the lens of long-term consequence rather than immediate reaction. It was so different from Damon's short-sighted decisions, driven by pressure from his father and fear of insufficient strength, that she found herself studying Cade with fresh curiosity. You think in decades, she observed, not seasons. Lycans live considerably longer than shifters, Cade said. It changes how one views time and consequence. Decisions that seem urgent in the moment often reveal themselves as minor inconveniences when viewed across a longer span. And our bond? Elena asked quietly. Is that a decade's decision or a season's? Cade stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his amber eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. I did not enter this bond expecting it to matter beyond its immediate political usefulness, he admitted. But I find myself reconsidering that assessment more with each passing day. Elena's heart quickened at his words, though she was uncertain whether it was her own reaction or some echo of the bond amplifying her feelings. As do I, she admitted quietly. They stood there for a long moment in the afternoon light, something unspoken passing between them, the bond humming faintly beneath the surface of the conversation. Then Cade nodded once, as though settling some internal matter, and gestured for them to continue toward the manor. There is a matter I must attend to this evening, he said as they walked. A message arrived this morning from the Southern Territories. It seems word of our bond has already reached beyond my own lands. Elena felt a flicker of unease at his words. What kind of message? One requesting a formal audience, Cade said, his expression growing more guarded. From a faction that has long contested my claim to this territory. It seems our bond has drawn more attention than even I anticipated, and not all of it welcome. Elena absorbed this news with a steadying breath, aware that whatever peace she had begun to find within Ravenswood's walls was likely to be tested sooner than she had hoped. But she had faced humiliation and heartbreak only days before, and survived it with her spine intact. Whatever challenge awaited them now, she intended to face it the same way. Then we should prepare, she said simply, and beside her, Cade's expression shifted into something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. Word of Elena's bonding to the Lycan Lord reached her former pack faster than anyone could have predicted, carried first by traveling merchants, and then confirmed by scouts sent to verify the rumor. By the time the news settled fully into the pack's collective awareness, it had already reshaped the way many viewed the events of that humiliating night in the Great Hall. Serafina heard the news while sitting in her private chambers within the Ashcombe compound, and she felt a cold, unwelcome tightening in her chest at the words. A messenger, breathless from the ride, had delivered the report directly to her, likely hoping for a generous reward for such significant information. The Lycan Lord, Serafina repeated slowly, testing the words as though they might reveal themselves to be a mistake. You are certain it was Elena Voss? Yes, my lady, the messenger confirmed. Bonded the very same night she was rejected. The forest villages speak of little else. After dismissing the messenger, Serafina sat alone for a long while, turning the information over in her mind. She had won, hadn't she? She had secured Damon, secured the alliance between their two packs, secured everything she had been raised since childhood to pursue. And yet the news of Elena's sudden, dramatic rise unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. The Lycan Lord's territory bordered 3 separate domains, and his reputation, though shrouded in mystery, was known even among the Ashcombe pack as formidable. If Elena had truly bonded herself to such a powerful figure, the balance of influence across the region could shift, in ways Serafina had not anticipated when she agreed to marry into the Ashford pack. She found Damon later that evening in the pack's council chamber, reviewing reports with his father, Alaric, the pack's aging alpha. Damon's expression, when he looked up and saw her, carried a tension she had grown accustomed to seeing in the days since the ceremony. You've heard then, Damon said, setting aside the papers in his hands. The entire territory has heard, Serafina replied, taking a seat across from him. What I want to know is what this means for us. Alaric, silent until now, finally spoke, his voice carrying the weariness of a leader who had hoped for a simpler resolution to recent events. It means we underestimated the girl. And it means we may have made a significant error in how we handled her departure. She was a half-blood, Serafina said. Though even as she spoke the words, they felt less certain than they once had. Her bloodline made the choice inevitable. Perhaps, Alaric said. But bloodline matters little to those who wield power through strength alone. And the Lycan bloodlines are older and stronger than any purity we could offer through alliance with your pack. If Elena Voss now stands beside a leader of that caliber, we have not simply rejected an unsuitable match. We have created a rival, with grievance and reason to remember exactly how she was treated. Damon shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Serafina studied him carefully, noting the guilt still lingering behind his eyes whenever Elena's name arose in conversation. It irritated her more than she wanted to acknowledge, this lingering attachment to a woman he had supposedly chosen to leave behind. You still think of her, Serafina said, once Alaric had excused himself to attend to other matters, leaving the two of them alone in the council chamber. Damon did not deny it immediately, and his hesitation told her everything she needed to know. I think of the choice I made, he said finally. Not necessarily of her, but of how I made her feel in that hall. It was not kind, Serafina. Whatever the necessity of the alliance, I could have handled it with more compassion. Compassion would not have changed the outcome, Serafina said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. The alliance was necessary regardless of how it was delivered. Perhaps, Damon said, but necessity does not excuse cruelty, and I fear we may have created a far greater problem than the one we solved. Serafina rose from her seat, moving to the narrow window that overlooked the pack's central courtyard, where guards trained beneath the fading evening light. Then we will simply need to ensure our own position remains strong enough that whatever grievance she carries cannot threaten us. And how do you propose we do that? Damon asked. By strengthening our alliance further, Serafina said. By ensuring the pack sees clear, undeniable benefit from the choice we made, so thoroughly that any comparison to what she might have gained becomes irrelevant. She turned back to face him, her expression resolute despite the uncertainty still churning beneath her composed exterior. We cannot afford weakness now, Damon. Not with a Lycan lord potentially watching our territory with new interest. Damon nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. I only hope our decisions have not put the entire pack at risk for the sake of bloodline pride. Meanwhile, within Ravenswood, Elena had begun adjusting to her new life, with a determination that surprised even herself. Each day brought new lessons, from Lycan customs and history taught patiently by Cade himself, to practical matters of managing the manor's affairs alongside Marissa, who had gradually warmed to Elena's presence, despite the household's initial uncertainty. The bond between Elena and Cade continued to deepen with each passing day, the strange awareness she felt of his presence growing steadily more refined, until she found she could sense not only his location, but subtle shifts in his mood, a faint emotional undercurrent that ran alongside her own thoughts like a second, quieter voice. One evening, several days after the news of the Southern faction's requested audience had arrived, Elena found Cade in his study, poring over old maps and correspondence, his expression drawn with the particular tension she had come to recognize as concern rather than mere focus. The Southern faction, she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Tell me more about them. Cade set aside the papers in his hands, studying her for a moment before answering. My brother leads them, he said finally. Elena straightened in surprise. Your brother? Half-brother, by circumstance rather than choice, Cade clarified. Our father sired us through different mothers, and when our father passed, the territory was meant to remain unified under my leadership. My brother, Ronan, disagreed with that arrangement rather violently, and has spent the years since attempting to carve out his own claim from what remains of our father's lands. And now he wants an audience, Elena said, because of our bond. Because our bond represents a shift he did not anticipate, Cade said. A stronger claim to leadership through partnership rather than solitary rule. He will likely use the unconventional nature of our bonding, your shifter heritage, as justification, to question whether it holds any legitimacy at all. Elena felt a flicker of unease at his words, though she forced herself to consider the situation with the same calculated clarity Cade always seemed to apply to challenges. Then we will need to prove otherwise, she said, whatever objections he raises. It will not be a simple audience, Cade warned. Ronan is not interested in reasoned debate. He is interested in finding any weakness he can exploit to challenge my leadership outright. And our bond, however strong it has grown between us privately, is exactly the kind of vulnerability he will look to expose. Then we prepare thoroughly, Elena said, meeting his gaze steadily. I did not survive humiliation in front of my entire pack, only to crumble before your brother's schemes. Something in Cade's expression shifted at her words, a flicker of genuine admiration breaking through his usual composed demeanor. No, he agreed quietly. I do not believe you did. Outside the study window, evening had settled fully over the forest surrounding Ravenswood, the darkness deepening into the kind of stillness that often preceded significant change. Elena felt the weight of the challenge ahead of her, aware that whatever came from Ronan's audience would test not only the strength of her bond with Cade, but her own resolve to prove herself worthy of the new life she had chosen in that forest clearing. She was ready, she realized, in a way she had never quite felt ready to face Damon's pack and its judgments. This challenge, however dangerous, was one she intended to meet head-on, not as someone seeking approval, but as someone determined to protect what she had begun to build. The days leading up to Ronan's arrival passed in a blur of preparation, and Elena found herself spending long hours with Cade in his study, absorbing everything she could about Lycan politics, history, and the particular customs that would govern the coming audience. It was during one of these sessions, late in the evening, with only candlelight illuminating the room, that Cade revealed something Elena had not anticipated. There is a reason your bloodline matters more than you realize, Cade said, setting aside an old, weathered book he had been reading from. Something beyond the simple fact of your shifter heritage. Elena looked up from the map she had been studying, curious at the sudden shift in his tone. What do you mean? Cade rose from his seat and moved to a locked cabinet along the far wall, retrieving an ancient, leather-bound tome that looked considerably older than anything else in the room. He set it carefully on the desk between them, opening it to a page marked with careful, faded script. Lycan bloodlines, though powerful, carry a significant vulnerability, Cade explained. Generations of concentrated strength have led to increasing rarity in successful bondings and births. Pure Lycan lines have grown thin, fragile in ways that our outward strength conceals. My own line, though strong, is not immune to this weakening. Elena studied the faded script, unable to fully decipher the old dialect it was written in. What does this have to do with me? Half-blood shifters, Cade said carefully, particularly those descended from human and shifter parentage, as you are, carry a genetic resilience that pure bloodlines have lost over generations of narrowing. It is rare, and largely unknown outside old records such as this one, but it is documented. Bonds formed between Lycans and individuals carrying this particular resilience have historically produced offspring of remarkable strength and stability. Elena sat back in her chair, absorbing the weight of his revelation slowly. You're saying I wasn't simply convenient, she said quietly. You're saying my bloodline, the very thing Damon rejected me for, is exactly what your people need. Yes, Cade said simply, watching her reaction carefully. I suspected this possibility when we first met in the forest, though I did not know for certain until I consulted these records more thoroughly in recent days. Your rejection was not merely cruel, it was based on an assumption about bloodline value that could not be further from the truth. Elena felt a complicated tangle of emotions rise within her, equal parts vindication and lingering hurt at the memory of that night in the Great Hall. Does this change anything about our bond? She asked finally. About why you chose me. It confirms a suspicion, rather than creates a new motivation, Cade said. I chose you first, because the situation and the timing suited both our needs. This knowledge simply adds another layer to why our bond may prove more significant than either of us initially anticipated. Elena considered this information carefully, turning the pages of the ancient tome with careful hands, studying passages she could only partially understand. Does Ronan know about this? She asked eventually. About the value of bloodlines like mine? If he does not know now, he will likely learn of it soon enough, Cade said, which gives us further reason to ensure our bond withstands whatever challenge he brings, before this knowledge becomes public enough for him to exploit it against us. Over the following days, Cade continued Elena's education, not only in matters of politics and history, but in the specific customs and expectations she would need to navigate during Ronan's visit. She learned the proper forms of address, the subtle signals of respect and challenge woven into Lycan formal gatherings, the ways in which strength was demonstrated not through aggression alone, but through composure and unwavering confidence. Elena also spent considerable time training in the manor's yard, sparring regularly with Halric and occasionally with Fenwick, who had grown increasingly supportive of her presence within the household as the days passed. Garrick remained more reserved, though Elena noticed his sharp gaze following her training sessions, with something that had shifted from outright skepticism to careful, considering observation. "You continue to surprise everyone here," Fenwick commented one afternoon, watching Elena disarm Halric for the third time that week. Garrick mentioned this morning that perhaps Lord Cade's judgment was sounder than he initially credited. "High praise, coming from Garrick," Elena said, accepting a towel from Marissa, who had taken to watching the training sessions with obvious enjoyment. "He does not offer praise easily," Fenwick agreed. "But he respects strength, and you have shown considerably more of it than he anticipated from someone he initially dismissed as a political liability." Elena allowed herself a small, satisfied smile at this news, though her thoughts quickly returned to the looming audience with Ronan. "Do you know much about Cade's brother?" she asked. Fenwick's expression grew more serious at the question. "Ronan is dangerous," he said bluntly, "not merely because of his strength, though he possesses considerable power in his own right. He is dangerous because he is patient and clever, willing to wait years for an opportunity to strike rather than acting impulsively. His request for an audience now, so soon after your bonding, suggests he sees an opportunity he does not intend to waste." "What kind of opportunity?" Elena asked. "Doubt," Fenwick said simply. "If he can convince enough of the surrounding territories that your bond with Lord Cade lacks legitimacy, lacks strength, he creates space for his own claims to leadership to gain traction. He does not need to defeat Lord Cade directly to succeed. He only needs to erode confidence in his leadership enough that others begin questioning whether Cade deserves his position." Elena absorbed this warning seriously, understanding now the true stakes of the coming audience. This was not merely a formal meeting to be endured, but a critical test of everything she and Cade had built together in these short, intense days since their bonding. That evening, Elena found Cade in the manor's private courtyard, standing beneath the night sky, with his gaze fixed on the distant tree line, his posture carrying a tension she had learned to recognize even from a distance, the bond between them humming with his unspoken concern. "You're worried," she said, approaching to stand beside him. "I am cautious," Cade corrected, though his tone carried an honesty that suggested he did not entirely disagree with her assessment. "Ronan has never requested a formal audience before. His willingness to do so now suggests confidence in whatever plan he intends to bring before us." "Then we meet that confidence with our own," Elena said firmly. "Whatever doubts he intends to raise about our bond, we will answer them together, not as separate entities uncertain of one another, but as partners who understand exactly what we have built." Cade turned to study her in the moonlight, something in his expression softening from its usual careful composure. "You continue to remind me why this bond was the correct choice," he said quietly, regardless of the political convenience that first brought us together. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, a warmth she suspected was not entirely her own emotion, but an echo carried through the bond itself. "We should discuss exactly how we intend to counter whatever arguments Ronan brings," she said, forcing her focus back to practical matters, despite the growing intimacy of the moment. "Yes," Cade agreed, though he lingered a moment longer before turning back toward the manor. "There is still much to prepare before he arrives, and I suspect we will need every advantage we can secure before this audience begins." They spent the remainder of the evening deep in strategic discussion, mapping out every possible challenge Ronan might raise, and preparing thoughtful, unified responses to each. By the time exhaustion finally drove them both to seek rest, Elena felt more confident than she had since first learning of the impending audience, buoyed not only by her own preparation, but by the growing certainty that whatever came next, she would face it standing firmly beside a partner who had come to genuinely value her strength, her honesty, and the bond they had chosen together, beneath that ancient forest moon. Ronan arrived at Ravenswood 3 days later, accompanied by a modest but clearly capable retinue of guards, all dressed in dark colors that mirrored Cade's own household, a visual reminder that despite their rivalry, the two brothers shared common blood and common customs. Elena watched from an upper window as the group approached the manor gates, studying the man who would soon challenge everything she and Cade had built together. Ronan was tall, though not quite as broad through the shoulders as Cade, his dark hair cropped close, and his expression carrying a cold, calculating quality even from this distance. He moved with the same predatory grace Elena had noticed in Cade during their first meeting in the forest, though something about his bearing felt sharper, more deliberately performative, as though every gesture was carefully chosen for its effect on those observing him. By the time Elena made her way down to the Great Hall, Ronan had already been received formally by Cade, and the two brothers stood facing one another across the polished stone floor, their guards arranged along the walls in careful, watchful positions. "Brother," Ronan said, his voice carrying a note of amusement that did not quite reach his eyes. "It has been too long since our last meeting." "Circumstances rarely bring us together willingly," Cade replied evenly. "I trust your journey was uneventful." "Eventful enough," Ronan said, his gaze shifting toward Elena as she entered the hall, sweeping over her with an assessment that felt distinctly clinical, as though he were evaluating livestock rather than meeting a person. "So this is the bonded mate everyone speaks of, a shifter, I understand. Half-blood, no less." "Elena Voss," Cade said, his tone carrying a subtle warning that Elena suspected only those who knew him well would recognize. "My bonded partner." "A fascinating choice," Ronan said, moving closer with unhurried steps, studying Elena with open curiosity that bordered on insolence. "One that has certainly generated considerable discussion across the territories. Tell me, Elena, was it love that drew you to my brother, or merely convenient timing following your rather public humiliation?" Elena felt anger flare within her at his deliberately provocative words, but she forced herself to remain composed, drawing on every lesson Cade had shared with her over the preceding days. "Our bond was formed through mutual choice and clear understanding," she said evenly. "Whatever circumstances brought us together, the strength of what we have built since is not diminished by its origins." Ronan's eyebrows lifted slightly at her measured response, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his features before his composed mask settled back into place. "Well spoken," he said, though words alone rarely convince skeptical minds, particularly when so much political convenience surrounds the timing of your bonding. "Perhaps we should move this conversation to a more appropriate setting," Cade suggested, his tone remaining carefully neutral, despite the tension clearly building beneath the surface of the exchange. "You requested this audience for a purpose, Ronan. Let us address it directly, rather than through veiled implications." Ronan's expression shifted, the performative amusement giving way to something colder, more focused. "Very well," he said. "I will speak plainly then. The surrounding territories question the legitimacy of a bond formed so hastily, between a Lycan lord and a shifter with no standing among the noble bloodlines. Some suggest this arrangement reflects desperation rather than strength, an attempt to manufacture stability where none genuinely exists. And you have come here to voice these concerns yourself, rather than allow them to remain mere rumor," Cade observed. "I have come," Ronan said, "because I believe the territories deserve clarity. If your bond with this woman is genuine, if it carries the strength required to secure your leadership, then it should withstand scrutiny. If it does not, then perhaps it is time for the territories to consider leadership less encumbered by questionable alliances." The implication in his words was unmistakable, and Elena felt the weight of the challenge settle heavily over the hall. This was not merely a discussion of legitimacy. This was Ronan positioning himself to challenge Cade's leadership directly, using their bond as the pretext to justify whatever move he intended to make next. "What precisely do you propose?" Cade asked, his voice remaining steady despite the clear escalation in his brother's tone. "A formal test," Ronan said, witnessed by representatives from the surrounding territories. "Let your bonded mate demonstrate the strength and worth you claim she carries. If she succeeds, I will withdraw my concerns publicly and lend my support to your continued leadership. If she fails, however, you will understand why the territories may look elsewhere for stronger guidance." Elena's pulse quickened at the proposal, understanding immediately the danger it represented. Whatever test Ronan had in mind, it was almost certainly designed to expose weakness rather than demonstrate strength, a trap disguised as an opportunity. "What kind of test?" Elena asked, refusing to allow Cade to answer on her behalf, determined to face this challenge directly. Ronan's gaze shifted toward her, something almost approving in his expression at her willingness to engage directly. "A combat trial," he said, "against one of my own guards, chosen for their skill. Nothing lethal, of course, merely a demonstration of the strength and capability that supposedly justifies your place beside my brother." Elena glanced toward Cade, and through the bond she felt his sharp, immediate concern, though his expression remained carefully composed for the benefit of their audience. She understood the risk clearly. A defeat, even a narrow one, would hand Ronan exactly the justification he needed to undermine Cade's leadership before the assembled territories. But she also understood something else, something she had proven to herself repeatedly in the days since her arrival at Ravenswood. She was not the same woman who had stood helplessly in that great hall while Damon rejected her, before an audience of familiar faces. She had trained, had proven her strength repeatedly against Cade's own guards, had earned genuine respect from those who had initially doubted her. "I accept," Elena said, before Cade could voice whatever reservations she sensed building within him through the bond. Ronan's smile widened slightly, though whether from satisfaction or genuine surprise, Elena could not be certain. "Excellent," he said. "Then let us arrange the trial for tomorrow, once representatives from the neighboring territories have been notified and given opportunity to attend as witnesses." Once Ronan and his retinue had been shown to guest quarters within the manor, Cade turned to Elena, with visible tension finally breaking through his composed exterior. "You should not have accepted so quickly," he said, though his tone carried more concern than criticism. "This is precisely the kind of trap Ronan excels at constructing." "I understand the risk," Elena said, "but refusing would have handed him the same advantage he seeks, simply through a different path. If I decline the challenge, he claims cowardice or weakness. If I accept and lose, he claims validation of his doubts. The only way to counter his strategy is to accept and win decisively." Cade studied her for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing instincts, protective concern warring against respect for her judgment. "The guard he chooses will be formidable," he warned. "Ronan would not propose this trial without confidence in the outcome he expects. Then I will need to train harder over the remaining hours before the trial begins," Elena said firmly. "And you will need to trust that the strength I have shown you these past days was not merely a display for your benefit, but a genuine reflection of my capability." Cade's expression softened slightly, though the concern remained evident beneath his composed exterior. "I do trust it," he said quietly. "I simply do not wish to see you harmed, defending a position that was never entirely your burden to bear alone." "It became my burden the moment I chose this bond," Elena said. "Just as your position became something I chose to defend alongside you. We agreed to face challenges as partners, Cade. This is simply the first true test of that promise." Something in Cade's expression shifted at her words, a quiet resolve settling over his features that mirrored her own determination. "Then we prepare thoroughly," he said. "Whatever guard Ronan selects, we will ensure you face them fully ready." Throughout that evening, and into the early hours of the following morning, Elena trained with a focus and intensity she had never before summoned, drawing not only on her own considerable skill, but on the growing strength of the bond itself, which seemed to sharpen her instincts and reflexes in ways she was only beginning to understand. Whatever awaited her in that trial, she intended to meet it not as someone fighting merely to prove her worth, but as someone fighting to protect everything she had built in these short, transformative days since fleeing that humiliating ceremony in her former pack's great hall. The sun would rise soon on a day that would determine far more than a single combat trial. It would determine whether the bond she and Cade had formed could withstand the full weight of political scrutiny, and whether the strength Elena had always possessed, the strength that Damon had failed to recognize, would finally be seen clearly by all who doubted her. The morning of the trial arrived with a gray, overcast sky that seemed to mirror the tension gathering across Ravenswood's grounds. By midday, representatives from 3 neighboring territories had arrived, along with a modest crowd of curious onlookers, drawn by rumors of the unusual spectacle about to unfold. Elena stood at the edge of the training yard, now transformed into a formal trial ground marked with a wide circle of packed earth, and watched as the assembled witnesses took their positions along the perimeter. Cade stood beside her, his expression carefully composed for the benefit of the watching crowd, though Elena could feel his tension humming faintly through their bond. Garrick and Fenwick stood nearby, along with Marissa, who had insisted on being present despite her clear nervousness at the prospect of witnessing Elena face combat before such a significant audience. Ronan arrived shortly after, accompanied by his chosen guard, a broad, heavily muscled man named Torvin, whose reputation for combat skill had apparently preceded him among the gathered witnesses. Elena studied her opponent carefully as he entered the circle, noting the confident ease in his movements, the calculated way he assessed her in return. "Are you certain of this?" Cade asked quietly, one final moment before the trial was set to begin. "There is still time to reconsider the terms." "I have never been more certain," Elena said, meeting his gaze steadily. "Whatever happens in that circle, I intend to prove that strength does not require pure bloodlines to be genuine." Cade studied her for a long moment, something fierce and proud flickering behind his composed exterior. "Then fight well," he said quietly. "I will be watching every moment." Elena stepped into the circle, and the assembled crowd fell silent, the weight of anticipation settling heavily over the training yard. Ronan, standing near the circle's edge with his arms crossed, offered a small nod toward the witnesses gathered from neighboring territories, ensuring their attention was fully engaged before the trial began. "The terms are simple," Ronan announced, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "First to yield, or first unable to continue, determines the outcome. Nothing lethal, as agreed, but nothing held back either." Torvin entered the circle opposite Elena, rolling his shoulders with practiced ease, clearly confident in the outcome ahead. Elena drew a steadying breath, settling into the ready stance she had practiced countless times over the preceding days, and waited for the signal to begin. When it came, Torvin moved first, testing her defenses with a powerful strike that Elena deflected with careful precision, feeling the jarring impact travel up through her arms, despite her successful block. She recognized immediately the significant strength difference between them, understanding that a direct contest of force would not favor her. Instead, she fell back on the lessons she had absorbed throughout her training, both within her former pack and during her intensive preparation at Ravenswood, relying on speed and precision rather than raw power. She circled Torvin carefully, watching for openings, deflecting his strikes rather than meeting them head-on, conserving her strength while he expended considerable effort, trying to overwhelm her with force alone. The crowd watched intently, murmurs rising and falling as the exchange continued. Elena's defensive strategy clearly not what many had expected from a half-blood shifter facing a Lycan guard. She caught glimpses of Ronan's expression during brief pauses in the combat, noting his growing frustration as the trial extended beyond what he had likely anticipated. Minutes passed, the combat growing increasingly intense as Torvin adjusted his own strategy, becoming more calculated in his attacks rather than relying purely on strength. Elena felt fatigue beginning to build in her muscles, but she drew on the strange, sharpening awareness the bond had granted her, a heightened instinct that seemed to anticipate Torvin's movements just fractions of a second before he made them. Finally, an opening presented itself, a slight overextension in one of Torvin's strikes that left him briefly vulnerable. Elena moved instinctively, using his own momentum against him, sweeping his legs out from beneath him with a precise, well-timed strike that sent him crashing to the packed earth of the training circle. The crowd erupted into surprised murmurs as Elena stepped back, allowing Torvin the opportunity to rise, though his expression now carried far less confidence than it had at the trial's beginning. He climbed back to his feet, clearly frustrated, and renewed his attack with increased aggression, abandoning his earlier caution. Elena met this renewed aggression with calm, measured defense, recognizing that his frustration was making him careless, his strikes becoming increasingly predictable as his composure slipped. She waited patiently for the decisive opening she knew would eventually present itself, drawing on every ounce of discipline she had cultivated throughout her training. When the opening came, she moved decisively, countering one of his overcommitted strikes with a precise blow that left him staggering, followed immediately by another sweeping strike that finally brought him down completely, unable to immediately rise from the packed earth. Silence fell over the training yard as Torvin remained down, breathing hard, clearly unable to continue the trial. Elena stood over him for a moment, her own breathing ragged from the exertion, before stepping back and allowing the trial's conclusion to be formally acknowledged. "The trial is decided," Cade announced, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, though Elena could hear the barely contained pride beneath his formal tone. Elena Voss has proven her strength and capability beyond question. The gathered witnesses erupted into murmured discussion, several exchanging surprised glances at the unexpected outcome. Elena glanced toward Ronan, whose expression had shifted from confident anticipation to carefully controlled displeasure, though he offered no immediate protest against the trial's clear result. "A skilled performance," Ronan said finally, once the initial murmur of the crowd had settled. "Though skill in a single combat trial does not necessarily prove the deeper legitimacy of a bond formed under questionable circumstances." "You proposed the terms yourself," Cade said, his voice hardening slightly despite his continued composure. "Elena met and exceeded every expectation you established. If you now seek to dismiss the outcome simply because it did not favor your expectations, the witnesses gathered here will draw their own conclusions about your credibility." Ronan's jaw tightened, clearly aware that further protest would only damage his own standing before the assembled representatives. "The trial's outcome stands," he said finally, forcing the words out with visible reluctance. "I withdraw my public concerns regarding the legitimacy of your bond." As Ronan and his retinue prepared to depart Ravenswood shortly after, Elena found herself approached by several of the visiting representatives, their expressions carrying newfound respect rather than the skeptical curiosity that had greeted her arrival that morning. She answered their questions carefully, aware that every word and gesture during these interactions would shape how her bond with Cade was perceived across the broader territories in the days and weeks ahead. Once the visiting representatives had departed, and Ravenswood's grounds had finally settled back into their usual quiet, Elena found Cade waiting for her in the manor's private courtyard, his expression finally free of the careful composure he had maintained throughout the day's proceedings. "You fought brilliantly," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth she had rarely heard from him before. "I confess, I underestimated how thoroughly you would silence every doubt Ronan hoped to raise." "We silenced them together," Elena said, allowing herself to finally relax now that the trial's tension had passed. "Your trust in me made facing that trial considerably easier than it would have been otherwise." Cade studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his amber eyes that Elena had not seen before, a warmth that went beyond mere political satisfaction or strategic relief. "Elena," he said quietly, "whatever this bond began as, I find myself increasingly grateful for the circumstances that brought you into my forest that night." Elena felt her heart quicken at his words, understanding the significance of such an admission, from a man who had approached their entire arrangement with such careful, calculated pragmatism. "As am I," she said softly, meeting his gaze steadily, "grateful, and increasingly certain that whatever challenges still lie ahead, we will face them exactly as we did today, together." The evening settled peacefully over Ravenswood, the day's tension finally giving way to a quiet sense of accomplishment and growing trust between two people who had begun their bond as strangers, bound by convenience, and were steadily becoming something far more genuine with each challenge they faced side by side. Weeks passed following the trial, and news of Elena's decisive victory spread steadily across the surrounding territories, reshaping perceptions of both her bond with Cade and her own individual strength. Ravenswood settled into a quieter rhythm, though Elena sensed the underlying tension had not fully dissipated, merely shifted into new forms as autumn deepened across the forest surrounding the manor. It was during this period of relative calm that word arrived of a formal request from her former pack, delivered by a nervous messenger who clearly understood the delicate nature of the correspondence he carried. Cade received the message first, reading it carefully before passing it to Elena with an expression she could not quite interpret. "Your former pack requests a formal alliance meeting," Cade said, as Elena scanned the careful, formal script. "It seems Alaric recognizes the shifting balance of power your bond has created, and wishes to secure favorable terms before that balance shifts further against his pack's interests." Elena read through the message twice, absorbing the careful diplomatic language that nonetheless barely concealed the underlying desperation of a pack, recognizing its diminishing standing. "They want an alliance with you," she said slowly, not realizing, apparently, that such an alliance would require dealing directly with me as well. Or perhaps realizing exactly that, Cade suggested, and hoping the political necessity of the arrangement will smooth over whatever personal history exists between you and their pack's leadership. Elena considered this possibility, feeling a complicated tangle of emotions rise at the prospect of facing Damon and his pack again, now standing in an entirely different position than the humiliated, rejected woman who had fled that ceremony months before. "Do you intend to accept their request?" she asked. "I intend to consider it carefully," Cade said. "Your former pack's territory, while modest, borders lands that would benefit from stronger security arrangements, but I will not pursue any alliance that causes you discomfort or forces you to endure treatment you do not wish to face again." Elena appreciated his careful consideration, though something within her, a quiet determination that had been steadily building since her arrival at Ravenswood, urged her toward a different response. "I want to accept," she said finally. "Not despite the discomfort it may cause, but because of what it would mean to face them again, standing exactly where I stand now." Cade studied her for a long moment, clearly recognizing the significance behind her decision. "Then we will arrange the meeting," he said. "Though I suspect Serafina, in particular, will find your presence considerably more challenging to manage than she anticipates." The meeting was arranged for 2 weeks later, to be held on neutral ground along the border between Cade's territory and her former pack's lands. As the appointed day approached, Elena found herself unexpectedly calm, the anxious uncertainty she might have once felt at the prospect replaced by a steady confidence built through months of proving her strength and worth within Ravenswood's walls. When the day finally arrived, Elena stood beside Cade at the head of a modest but clearly capable retinue, watching as her former pack's representatives approached the meeting ground. Damon led the group, flanked by Serafina and Alaric, their expressions carrying careful diplomatic composure that nonetheless could not fully conceal the underlying tension of the encounter. "Lord Cade," Alaric said formally, offering a respectful bow, "we appreciate your willingness to consider this alliance." "The consideration is mutual," Cade replied evenly. "Though I trust you understand my bonded partner's perspective will carry equal weight in any terms we negotiate." Alaric's gaze shifted toward Elena, something complicated flickering behind his composed expression, an acknowledgement perhaps of how thoroughly circumstances had shifted since their last significant interaction. "Elena," he said, his tone carrying careful respect, "it is good to see you well." "Thank you," Elena replied simply, refusing to offer more warmth than the situation genuinely called for. Damon's gaze, meanwhile, remained fixed on Elena, with an intensity that suggested considerably more turmoil beneath his composed exterior than his father displayed. "Elena," he said quietly, once the formal introductions had concluded, "I did not expect to see you representing Lord Cade's interests so directly." "There is a great deal you did not expect from me, apparently," Elena replied evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching, "including the possibility that rejection might lead somewhere other than the ruin you likely anticipated." Serafina, standing beside Damon, studied Elena with an expression carrying poorly concealed unease. "Your bond with Lord Cade has certainly proven more consequential than anyone anticipated," she said, her voice carrying an edge of tension despite her attempt at diplomatic composure. "Consequences often surprise those who assume they understand the full value of what they choose to discard," Elena replied, her tone remaining calm despite the pointed nature of her words. The formal negotiations that followed proceeded with careful, measured diplomacy, Cade and Elena presenting a unified front that clearly unsettled the visiting delegation more than they had anticipated. Elena found herself contributing substantively to the discussion, her intimate knowledge of her former pack's territory and resources providing valuable insight that Cade acknowledged openly throughout the proceedings. During a brief pause in the formal discussions, Serafina approached Elena privately, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of resentment and something that might have been grudging curiosity. "I confess I did not expect you to rise so quickly," she said quietly, once they stood beyond easy earshot of the others. "Most would have crumbled entirely after such a public humiliation." "Most, perhaps," Elena said, "but I discovered that humiliation only defines you if you allow it to. I chose a different path, and found genuine happiness with the Lycan Lord." Serafina asked, an undertone of doubt still evident despite her careful phrasing. Elena considered the question seriously, aware that her answer carried significance beyond mere personal satisfaction. "I found a partner who values honesty over convenient bloodlines," she said finally. "Whatever else this bond has become, it began with mutual respect, something I never found within Damon's affections, regardless of how genuine he might claim they were." Serafina's expression flickered with something that might have been discomfort at this pointed observation, though she said nothing further, returning instead to Damon's side as the formal negotiations resumed. By the meeting's conclusion, terms had been established that secured meaningful protection for Elena's former pack, while strengthening Cade's border security considerably, an arrangement that clearly benefited both parties, despite the underlying tension that had colored the entire encounter. As the delegations prepared to depart their separate ways, Damon approached Elena one final time, his expression carrying something that finally resembled genuine regret rather than mere discomfort. "I made a mistake that night," he said quietly, out of earshot of the others. "I understand that acknowledging it now changes nothing about what happened, but I wanted you to know regardless." Elena studied him for a long moment, feeling the last remnants of old hurt finally settling into something more like distant, faded memory rather than active pain. "Thank you for saying so," she said honestly. "But you should also know that whatever mistake you made, it led me toward a life I would not trade for anything you could have offered me instead." Damon absorbed her words silently, something in his expression suggesting genuine acceptance of the finality behind them. "I hope your happiness continues," he said finally, before turning to rejoin his own delegation. As Elena watched her former pack's representatives depart across the border into their own territory, she felt Cade's presence settle beside her, his hand finding hers with a gentle, steadying warmth. "You handled that with remarkable grace," he said quietly. "I handled it with the strength you helped me discover," Elena corrected, meeting his gaze with genuine affection that had grown steadily throughout their months together. "There is a considerable difference." Cade studied her for a long moment, something warm and unmistakably genuine settling behind his amber eyes. "Whatever the source," he said, "I find myself increasingly certain that this bond has become far more than the convenient arrangement it began as." "As do I," Elena agreed softly, and together, they turned to make their way back toward Ravenswood, leaving behind the last remnants of a past that no longer held any power over the future they were steadily building together. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Ravenswood's forest in a thick layer of pristine snow that transformed the manor's grounds into something that felt almost enchanted in the pale morning light. Elena stood at the window of the private study, watching snowflakes drift lazily past the glass, reflecting on how thoroughly her life had transformed since that desperate night she had fled through these very woods, wounded and humiliated, uncertain of anything beyond her immediate need to escape. Months had passed since the alliance meeting with her former pack, months during which the bond between Elena and Cade had continued deepening into something neither of them had fully anticipated when they first exchanged blood and vows beneath that ancient forest moon. What had begun as calculated political convenience had steadily transformed into a partnership built on genuine trust, mutual respect, and an affection that had grown so naturally Elena sometimes struggled to remember exactly when it had shifted from careful arrangement into something considerably more precious. A knock at the study door drew her from her thoughts, and Marissa entered carrying a folded piece of parchment bearing an official seal Elena did not immediately recognize. "This arrived from the Northern Council," Marissa said, offering the message with visible curiosity. "They've requested Lord Cade's presence, along with yours, for a formal gathering next month." Elena accepted the message, breaking the seal carefully to reveal an invitation extending recognition to both Cade and herself as joint leaders of Ravenswood's territory, a formal acknowledgement from the broader Lycan Council of the legitimacy and strength their bond had demonstrated throughout the preceding months. She found Cade in the training yard below, overseeing a group of new guards recently arrived from neighboring territories, seeking to serve under his leadership, their numbers steadily growing as word of Ravenswood's stability and strength continued spreading. Elena descended to join him, the invitation still held carefully in her hands. "The Northern Council has requested our joint presence," she said, handing him the parchment as he turned to greet her. "Formal recognition, it seems, of everything we have built together." Cade read through the message carefully, his expression shifting into something Elena recognized as quiet, genuine satisfaction. "This is significant," he said. "Formal recognition from the Northern Council carries weight across every territory bordering our own. It effectively silences any remaining doubt about the legitimacy of our leadership." "Our leadership," Elena repeated softly, savoring the words. "Not simply yours, secured through my presence, but genuinely ours, recognized as equal partnership. As it should be, Cade said, setting aside the parchment to study her more closely. You have proven yourself these past months, in ways that extend far beyond the initial political convenience that first brought us together. Every challenge we have faced, you have met with strength and clarity that has earned genuine respect throughout these territories. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest, though she suspected, as she often did now, that some portion of that warmth traveled directly from Cade through the deepening bond between them. We faced those challenges together, she said. That has always been the foundation of whatever strength we have shown. That evening, as snow continued falling gently outside Ravenswood's windows, Cade requested Elena join him in the manor's great hall, where she found the space transformed with warm candlelight, and gathered members of the household, including Marissa, Fenwick, Grerick, and Halric, along with several other guards and staff, who had become genuine friends and allies throughout her time within these walls. "What is this?" Elena asked, glancing curiously between the gathered faces. "A celebration," Cade said, moving to stand before her, his expression carrying a warmth she had rarely seen him display so openly before an audience. "Of everything we have built together, and of the formal recognition our bond has now earned throughout the Northern Territories." Garrick, who had transformed from Elena's most skeptical critic into one of her most genuine supporters throughout the preceding months, stepped forward with a small, formal bow. "When you first arrived, Lady Elena, I confess, I doubted the wisdom of Lord Cade's choice," he said. "I have rarely been more grateful to be proven wrong." Elena felt genuine emotion rise at his words, recognizing how far she had traveled from that humiliated woman who had once stood alone in an unfamiliar forest clearing, uncertain of anything beyond her immediate grief and desperate need for a different path forward. Fenwick offered his own words shortly after, along with Halric and several of the other guards who had trained alongside her throughout the months since her arrival, each acknowledgement adding to the growing sense that Elena had genuinely found not merely acceptance within these walls, but a true home among people who valued her strength and character, rather than questioning her bloodline. As the evening's celebration continued, Cade eventually drew Elena aside to the manor's private courtyard, where the falling snow had begun settling in soft drifts across the stone pathways, illuminated by scattered lanterns that cast warm, golden light against the gathering darkness. "I have something further to discuss with you," Cade said, his expression carrying a seriousness that drew Elena's full attention, despite the celebratory atmosphere they had just left behind. "Something beyond the political recognition we received today." "What is it?" Elena asked, studying him carefully. Cade reached into the folds of his dark clothing, producing a small object that caught the lantern light as he opened his palm to reveal it. A ring, simply crafted but unmistakably beautiful, its band inlaid with delicate silver markings that Elena recognized from the ancient texts Cade had shown her months before, symbols representing permanence and chosen commitment within Lycan tradition. "Our bond began as necessity," Cade said quietly, "formed hastily, beneath a forest moon, to serve purposes neither of us fully understood at the time. But what has grown between us since that night has become something I no longer wish to define, merely through political convenience or strategic advantage." Elena's breath caught, understanding the significance of the moment unfolding before her, feeling the bond between them pulse with warmth and unmistakable sincerity. "I want to choose you again," Cade continued, "not because circumstance or necessity demands it, but because I have come to value everything you are, your strength, your honesty, your unwavering resolve, more deeply than I ever anticipated possible. This ring represents that choice, made freely and completely, beyond whatever practical purposes first bound us together." Elena felt tears gather in her eyes, though these carried none of the grief and humiliation that had once driven her fleeing through these same woods. These were tears of genuine happiness, the kind she had once believed impossible to find after Damon's rejection had left her feeling fundamentally unworthy of real love. "I choose you too," she said softly, extending her hand as Cade slipped the ring carefully onto her finger. "Not because I need your protection, or because political convenience demands it, but because you have shown me what genuine partnership looks like, built on respect rather than obligation." Cade drew her closer, and Elena felt the bond between them pulse with a warmth and completeness that surpassed anything they had experienced during their initial bonding months before. Whatever calculated arrangement had first brought them together in that desperate midnight forest, It had transformed steadily into something far more precious. A genuine partnership built through shared challenges, mutual respect, and a love that had grown naturally from honest foundations rather than empty promises. Outside the courtyard, snow continued falling softly across Ravenswood's grounds, blanketing the forest that had once witnessed Elena's darkest grief in a pristine, peaceful quiet. She thought, standing there in Cade's arms beneath the gentle lantern light, of the humiliated woman who had once fled through those very trees, uncertain of anything beyond her immediate pain. That woman could never have imagined the strength and happiness Elena had found since. The genuine home she had built within walls that once felt entirely foreign, the partnership that had grown from calculated necessity into something far more enduring than any bond secured merely through bloodline or convenient alliance. She was no longer simply Elena Voss, the rejected half-blood shifter discarded for failing to meet an arbitrary standard of purity. She had become something far stronger, recognized throughout the Northern Territories as a leader in her own right, valued not despite her heritage, but because of the genuine strength and resilience it represented. As the celebration continued within the great hall behind them, and snow settled gently across the ancient forest surrounding Ravenswood, Elena allowed herself to fully embrace the life she had built, standing beside a partner who had chosen her not for political convenience alone, but for everything she genuinely was. The rejection that had once felt like the ending of everything she had hoped for had instead become the beginning of a life far richer and more genuine than anything she could have imagined, that desperate night beneath the ancient forest moon.